So I understand you all have a break coming up, and so this is a super exciting presentation right before you get to have a break. So I'm hoping I can keep everyone awake. We're going to keep this fairly short. It's only going to be about an hour. This is about 4 hours probably worth of information, so it's going to be pared down quite significantly. If I don't use a microphone very often, so if I'm not using this correctly, please someone just like give me a nod or shake your head at me. If Tennant's doing it, I'm not going to know what to do with that. But so learning disorders, it's a term that's used frequently and often incorrectly. When you go to a pediatrician, you might hear a pediatrician make a comment about a child having a learning disorder or a learning disability, and they're referring to someone who actually has a developmental disability. And so oftentimes this term, this diagnosis, is used kind of in a very general fashion, but it actually means something very, very specific. And so I'm hoping by the end of today that you'll have a good understanding of what it is and what it means moving forward. So the purpose of this is not to try and put you in a position where you're diagnosing learning disorders, but rather so that you can identify students who possibly have a learning disorder or ones who have been previously diagnosed with a learning disorder so we can best support them. And I'm going to be moving through this fairly quickly. So a learning disorder is often termed a learning disability, or you might even see in a report, reading disorder, disorder of written expression, mathematics disorder, and now most recently the term is specific learning disorder. If you see that in a report, provided it's an accurate diagnosis, that means something very specific, and those terms could all be used interchangeably. So when you're teaching a student, the main goal is to determine, is this a cognitive issue or is this a decoding issue? Those are the two main issues why someone's going to be struggling keeping up in class or performing in class, separate from things like attendance, behavior, that sort of thing. And so if it's a cognitive issue, that means something very different than if it's a learning disorder. A decoding issue means that they're struggling with some of the basic literacy and numeracy components of school. A cognitive issue generally means they're struggling with comprehension, which is a very different thing. Where it complicates things is when a decoding issue is causing the comprehension issue. And so that depends on kind of how we're using reading, writing, and math skills to provide opportunities for comprehension. So a specific learning disorder, by definition, is when there are literacy and numeracy impairments and their cognitive abilities, meaning reasoning, problem solving, memory skills, language development, all those things that are more fundamental to brain functioning, cannot explain why the student is struggling with decoding. Now, oftentimes I'm speaking to elementary or middle school teachers. At a high school level, this is somewhat different, because at this point, we have certain assumptions about students that they are at a certain level with regard to their decoding skills, and even kids with learning disorders by high school have oftentimes done certain things, worked on certain areas that allow them to, for lack of a better term, hide their learning disorder. And so they're a lot less obvious than they are in elementary school. Has anyone ever heard a student or a friend or someone say, yeah, I used to really struggle with reading, but then all of a sudden it clicked? I still can't spell, but I can read really well now? Most of us have heard someone make that comment, or maybe ourselves who've made that comment. That's usually an indication that they've figured out ways to hide the learning disorder, but the issue's still there. There's a variety of reasons why it changes and how it presents as kids get older, but it doesn't diminish the need for support for those kids, because even though they may be able to read with relative accuracy at that point, there's still barriers that a learning disorder presents or results in as a result of the fundamental issue with decoding. A cognitive issue means they don't get it. It doesn't make sense. This information, even if you read it to them, even if you present it to them in a way that is removing all the barriers, they're still struggling with comprehension. And there will be a certain percentage of kids in your school that will struggle because of a cognitive issue. In my experience, more of the kids that are being referred to me, are kids who have potential learning disorders. The cognitive issues are typically a little bit easier to identify, not in all cases, but in a general sense, whereas learning disorders are a little bit more complex. It's not quite as simple to identify them. And so cognitive issues typically are identified quite early. By the high school level, if someone hasn't been assessed by a psychologist or undergone level B testing, usually that's not an indication of a learning disorder then, or sorry, of a cognitive issue. Usually it means that that could be a learning disorder. So when we're examining, and this is for any of you who have done level B training or have been involved in level B testing or results, this is the basic way we break down someone's academic profile. In the areas of reading, writing, and math, we look at skills, we look at applications. As a high school English teacher, are you more concerned with application or with basic skill? Application, right? It's all about comprehension. Can you understand at a higher level? The skill is what we use to get there though. And so if I can't read with fluency, with confidence, with accuracy, it's going to affect my comprehension. So with some kids it's really, really obvious. You can see it's clunky decoding. With some kids, depending on a variety of factors, and I've seen a number of kids at your school that have, again, developed decoding skills that you wouldn't identify them as struggling with decoding just based on some of the basic stuff you'd see in a classroom setting, but it seems like they're not getting it. But that's not always because it's a getting it issue, it could be a decoding issue. The more obvious one is spelling versus written expression. As an English teacher, you'd rather have a well-written essay with some spelling mistakes, but has good detail and content, as compared to a really, really basic essay with perfect spelling. At the high school level, at the college level, university level, it isn't about accurate spelling as much as it's about content. Ideally, there's both. But kids with learning disorders have a really hard time with spelling, because with spelling, unlike reading and math, there's really very few ways to hide poor spelling, because you've got a blank piece of paper in front of you. Now, if it's an essay that they've had a chance to edit and go through, that's a little different. But if it's an in-class assignment and someone is struggling with spelling, there's not that many tools that they can use to identify. Plus, they're not always going to see when they are struggling with spelling, because they don't know when something looks wrong. Or they might think it looks wrong, but they have no idea how to solve that. And so when someone has knowledge on a certain topic and they have a lot to say on it, but they pare down what they're trying to say because they're afraid of spelling mistakes, we're now missing it. If you're a high school English teacher, you don't want that. If you're a high school social studies teacher, you don't want that. Really, at any level, we don't want that. But what happens with kids who have learning disorders is that they choose to pare down what they're trying to say because they're afraid of spelling mistakes. And that's because from a very young age, we're talking from like 4 years old or sometimes even younger till oftentimes even 10, 11, 12 years old, we use spelling tests as one of our most common metrics for how is a student progressing in language arts. And spelling tests are a horrible way to identify how someone's doing in those areas. It's one of the most inaccurate. If I look at a level B result, if I look at just the scores, let's say Kirsten sends me a level B out, the printout, the last score I'm going to look at is spelling, in terms of identifying what do I think this person's cognitive capacity is. Because spelling is the worst indicator of cognitive ability. Yet we still use it as one of the measures in a lot of classrooms. And for kids who don't have learning disorders, that's okay. But when we have a learning disorder, it significantly impacts the comfort level of that student in terms of feeling like they can say what they want to. They might have a really descriptive paragraph that they want to write, but they're not going to write that because red ink sucks, right? And so spelling versus written expression, when we look at it and break it down based on skill versus application, it's a really important distinction. And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be teaching kids how to edit, but it does mean that we have to understand if there's a spelling mistake, but it was a really big word, the big word and the fact that they used it correctly is more important than whether they spelled it correctly. So one of the other things, and this isn't commonly, but this is for kids who have kind of higher functioning learning disorders, you'll often find that they'll use big words somewhat incorrectly. They'll either conjugate it incorrectly, or it'll be a very similar word, but it's not exactly the same word. Again, this is where if we focus too much, it doesn't mean we don't edit, but that is another way that, or we don't focus on editing, but it is another way that a learning disorder can present. It's not just always spelling. Sometimes there are times when we actually will substitute certain words because it looks right. It looks like a correct word. It's just not the correct word. So there's different ways that it presents with writing. Math is a little bit different because with math it's all about getting the right answer. And so oftentimes when I'm going through an assessment, if you struggle with decoding with reading and writing, with reading and spelling, you're most commonly also going to struggle with decoding with math. So within my test results or level B test results that are happening at your school, the test will show that there's a calculation deficit. But if I talk to the math teacher will say, no, they're doing great. And oftentimes they are, because they have the capacity to figure out the answer in a way that's somewhat unorthodox or atypical. But that oftentimes takes longer and results in more what appear to be careless errors. But in fact, the issue is that they're struggling with the decoding part, which means just like if you have a learning disorder, memorizing spelling words is really hard. If you have a learning disorder that affects math as well, which most commonly it will, memorizing math facts is also really hard. So having those automatic math facts makes math a lot easier. My dad was a math and physics teacher. Believe me, we had those drilled into our heads too. But when you have a learning disorder, just like memorizing spelling words is really hard, memorizing math facts is really hard. And math facts, understanding math facts, retaining math facts, don't make you good at math. They make math easier, but they don't make you good at math. What makes you good at math is if you understand concepts. If you can wrap your head around what the teacher is trying to explain and what the teacher is trying to express, and what am I supposed to get out of this? That's what makes someone good at math. So I remember growing up, my dad would force me, even if I knew the answer just by figuring out quickly in my head, he would force me to either draw it out or basically show that I understood, because he didn't want me just to memorize math facts. And that allows one to have a better, more solid understanding of the math concept. But again, the process, if you have a learning disorder, if you don't have your automatic math facts, the process is longer, it's more arduous, uses more mental energy. And so even though they're getting the right answers, we have to remember too, it could be taking them that much more time. They might be spending 3 times more, it might be instead of 1 hour of homework, it might be 3 hours of homework for them. And so that takes its toll. And there's certain things that we can do to adapt things to where they're still demonstrating understanding of the material, but we're still allowing them to say, well, I want to play on the basketball team, but if I take this class, I'm not going to be able to because I have to spend 3 hours every night on homework. Well, is there a way we can adapt things? Let's narrow the quantity down a little bit. That way they can still have some balance in their life while still putting the effort in that will allow them to do well in school. Because when you have a learning disorder, whether it's reading, writing, math, or most commonly all 3, it makes things take longer. It doesn't mean they can't do it, but it oftentimes means that it takes them a lot longer. So when we're looking at literacy and numeracy deficits, when we're doing a diagnosis, when we're looking at assessment information, we have to not only consider test scores, but also process-based factors. And that basically means how much intervention has the child received. When I'm assessing somebody whose parents are teachers, I have to know that. Because teachers value education, kids tend to have had a lot of intervention. And so that's a factor. Because that's kind of like saying, well, this person is smaller than average, but they were malnourished, and so as a result, are they smaller than average because they're just supposed to be smaller than average? Is there some sort of growth deficiency? Or have they just not been given proper food? Well, and this is the opposite of that, where kids who have learning disorders, but parents are teachers, oftentimes have figured out ways to cope, to compensate, to be successful despite having that fundamental underlying learning disorder. And they might even be getting decent grades, but there's still a threshold with that. I've worked with lots of kids who at the high school level, they've excelled all the way through. And then they hit a certain grade, and all of a sudden now they're not getting the 95 that they were getting before because they're running out of time. Or because they're making what look like little careless errors. And it's just because high school is harder than middle school. And so there's an underlying learning disorder that earlier on they could compensate for or cope with. But as you get older, school demands increase. And then all of a sudden now the things that were working when I was in grade 7 and grade 9 are not working in grade 11 or grade 12. And so those little things where I'm running out of time on exams, or by the end of the exam I'm so tired, I'm just guessing, because I've got nothing left. And so those are the little ways that, especially at a school like yours where you have a lot of advanced classes, you've got lots of kids who are very high achieving. High achieving students can also have learning disorders. In fact, a lot do. But they've figured out ways to cope and compensate. And so again, it doesn't mean that we need to just give them everything and make everything really easy, but it does mean we need to do certain things to allow them to demonstrate what they understand. And if they knew enough to get a 95% on an exam and they come up with a 75 or even an 85, we've inaccurately measured what we're supposed to be measuring. And that's where certain accommodations are really important. So I'm going to speed through some of these things that are a little bit more focused on younger kids. But one of the things that we consider is how much intervention has the child received, how motivated the student has been. Are there any other factors? I did an assessment one time, this is a number of years ago, where the child I was assessing was in grade 12, diagnosed autistic, very classic autism. What we would have called it Asperger's in the past, so high functioning autism. And always struggled with literacy and numeracy. Both parents were teachers. And he always struggled with word decoding, with spelling, especially spelling. But it was always thought, well, that's just part of being autistic. And it had nothing to do with autism. And so when I explained the results, I said, okay, there's autism, but now you need to understand your child also has a learning disorder. And their spelling mistakes, their decoding issues, their academic fluency issues have very little to do with the fact that they're autistic. That's a separate issue. These are two different things. So something like high functioning autism can also happen when there is a learning disorder. And so oftentimes we lump things together. Another one would be FAS. So I do all the assessments in Central Alberta for the FASD network, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And yesterday I had someone in my office who, she's 28 years old now, she can't spell. Her reading is really slow. She reads every night for at least half an hour. She loves to read. But as soon as I brought up spelling, she said, oh, I'm a horrible speller. And this is someone, again, remember, this is someone with a brain injury, with a permanent brain injury. And so she loves to read, she can't spell. Her IQ is fine. She's not low functioning. Not all people with FASD are. She has major executive functioning issues, which is like mental organization, mental efficiency, processing speed, short-term working memory, all those types of issues, major mental health issues. But her actual literacy issue, those issues are entirely separate from being prenatally exposed to alcohol. That's not what caused her literacy and numeracy issues. So in her case, early on, there was a pediatrician that just kind of wrote a letter stating she had FASD when she was probably about 10. So that diagnosis followed her all the way through. So now she's actually going through a multidisciplinary assessment to look at all these different areas of brain functioning. And in her case, I'm going to be diagnosing a specific learning disorder in addition to what our clinic will diagnose, which is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Two separate things. So oftentimes we'll have a student in our class and we'll be told, well, they're a medical code, they've got FAS. That doesn't mean that they're incapable in your class. It could mean that there's a learning disorder that goes along with some cognitive inconsistencies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're incapable, but they may need certain accommodations. And for this person, this 28-year-old, her life has been not very successful by traditional standards. Some of it you could say is due to the abuse and whatnot. That definitely has played a role. But when she was in school, everything was your FAS. She didn't go to school here, don't worry. But she was kind of lumped into that category of you are injured. Your brain doesn't work as well. And as a result, you're just not capable. So she was in what was the equivalent of K&E. She was capable of graduating from high school. She finished grade 10 before saying, I don't like this, this is not working for me, and she quit. And again, a lot of factors went into that, but one of the main things was she struggled with reading fluency, she couldn't spell accurately, she was embarrassed when she would make mistakes. And so oftentimes then that results in kids wanting to avoid, and especially for her, where there's a learning disorder, but it's one of many issues that she's facing. And it's kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. So that's kind of what the issue was for her. She stopped going to school when she was 16 because at that point there were enough other things that were causing her stress. School stress was just one thing I can avoid, so I'm going to quit that and out of school, find a job somewhere. But she had a learning disorder in addition to FASD. Sometimes it's also chicken or egg. There are kids with major behavioral issues and they'll have never been diagnosed with a learning disorder, and it's viewed, well, they don't do well in school, or they can't spell, or they can't remember their math facts because they're not paying attention in class, or because they're defiant. Oftentimes the defiance is a function of, I hate this because I'm not good at it. And so again, not necessarily as evident at the high school level, but that is something that early on, when there's so much focus on literacy and numeracy development in elementary school and even middle school, a lot of times kids are just really, really frustrated. I was out on Sunchild last week, and working with a little guy who the school said, oh, it's behaviors, and the reason for the referral was a behavioral issue. and I did an assessment, and he had an extreme learning disorder. They thought he was low functioning because he didn't do any work in class. They figured he just couldn't. His IQ was average. His cognitive capacity was average. His decoding skills were at about a 3 to 4 year old level, and this is an 11-year-old kid. It looked like behavior. Behavior was a byproduct. So the behavior was largely a function of what life was like for him. School sucks. I hate this. I'm not good at it. It's embarrassing. It wasn't a confident kid. He didn't have a healthy home life, but again, that's not why he was struggling in school. It was just another factor. This is a big one, and again, especially at a high school level, what does a student's cognitive or intellectual profile look like? If you have intellectual capacity that falls at the 95th percentile and you have a learning disorder, or you have intellectual capacity that falls at the 40th percentile and you have a learning disorder, it doesn't look the same. Okay, that's because when you have the capacity to learn at such a high level, you can figure out ways to hide or conceal or cope with that learning disorder in a way that lots of people can't. So this is a really important factor, and especially if you're teaching some of the higher level classes. Because someone, and I can think of, well, there's many, many examples where a student will have they'll have average literacy skills. Their decoding skills, their spelling skills will even maybe be low average to average. And we think, okay, well, they're just an average student, so them getting a 52 on this test kind of makes sense, but their capacity for learning is not average. Their capacity for learning might be 95th percentile, might be 98th percentile. And if you've got that capacity for learning and you're working hard and you're coming out with 52s or failing grades, that's usually an indication there's a bit of a disconnect there. Something is causing that, but it doesn't look like a learning disorder because, well, they're reading close to grade level. I've had this conversation with teachers about my own kids. It presents differently if your capacity for learning is a little bit higher. And this is why I've had lots of teachers say to me after going through assessment results and say, well, you just kind of described me. But then it just clicked for me. But again, now I still can't spell very well. But it's probably because, I mean, teachers, don't get too big a heads here, but teachers tend to be pretty bright. And so when someone has that level of capacity, again, 10 at a side, not you, but with that level of capacity, you can oftentimes hide it. But oftentimes, you might have someone who, let's say they're going to go into school and they wanted to become a radiologist. And then they go and they're like, man, but I'm getting 60 in bio in high school, and I'm getting 55 in physics, and these are all the prereqs to get into the program I want. So instead of becoming a radiologist, or that being my goal, I'm going to become an X-ray tech. Again, a great career, but I wanted to become a radiologist. I'm going to choose this other career because I didn't get the support I needed in order to get that next level. That's not what we want. I'd much rather have the radiologist who doesn't spell very well versus one who spells really well but doesn't have as much capacity and doesn't work as hard. So we want to make sure that we're considering, when we have a conversation with this student, how much of this are they getting? Because it seems like when I talk to them, they're really, really astute. They're really on this. They get it. They can connect things. But then when they write a test or they hand in an in-class assignment, it just doesn't seem like the same level. They must just kind of be lazy, or they must not be studying very much. Well, no, the conversation you had with them probably is a better indication. But if they're running out of time on an exam, or if they're afraid of making spelling mistakes, or if some of those basic decoding barriers are the basis for why they're not showing you as much on those formal assessments as they are within the informal conversations, again, that's a disconnect. We're not probably evaluating or assessing them as accurately as would be ideal. And most kids, not all, I mean, most of you will have read the book Mindset. There's been a lot of talk about how we continue to grow and how we continue to try and develop, challenge ourselves. But a lot of kids, by the time they've hit 3rd grade, have already decided whether they're good at school or not. And if you've decided in grade 3 that you're not good at school, even if you're really, really bright, because of those decoding issues, by the time you hit high school, you still have some of those fundamental insecurities. Some kids push through it. There are exceptions to what I'm saying, but a lot of kids have decided when they're 8 years old whether they are or are not good at school. And that belief system is fairly cemented. And so it's really important that we're recognizing it's not always that simple. In grade 3, in grade 2, in grade 1, in kindergarten, literacy development, numeracy development, those are the foundations of what we're doing every day. We're working on growing those skills. And if you've got a learning disorder that makes those things really hard, or harder than they should be, you're going to decide early on that probably I'm not very smart, or probably I don't have a very good memory, or probably I'm just not very good at school. And so a lot of kids, and this again depends on how they're being supported at school or at home, but a lot of kids will decide that. And if they're going home and hearing, yeah, I hated school too, buddy, it's okay. Then again, it just reinforces the idea that, okay, really this is not that important. I can probably go get a job doing something that doesn't require a lot of schooling. But a lot of those kids would like to, if you're gonna get an honest answer to them, they would like to do something that does require schooling. But they don't feel like it's an option, so the way to save face then is to choose a different path. I hate school. Why would I want to keep going to school? I suck at it. No, I mean, I just hate it. I hate it. We don't like things that we're not as naturally good at. That's human nature. If you automatically have a bit of success with something, it's usually motivating. That's why Chad Erickson's at the casino right now in Las Vegas, probably. He must have won one time. And so the reality is we tend to be motivated by a bit of success. And if early on in our school career we don't have much success with those basic building blocks, literacy, numeracy, we're less likely to show as much interest, again, depending on how we're supported. That's why, when we're having these conversations with elementary school teachers, it's so much about this topic. This is not as much of a topic for high school teachers, but it's still important to understand where the kids are coming from. Because most of the kids who have potential learning disorders or diagnosed learning disorders, it's not a new thing as of high school. It's something that was there early on. So we've already kind of talked about this. Literacy and numeracy, they're both just decoding, just with different symbols. And so if you struggle with decoding with literacy, most commonly, in my experience, it'd be at least 90% of the time, you're going to also struggle decoding with numbers. There's exceptions to that, but again, that's the most common. The difference is that in literacy, you can't hide it as well as you can with math. This is not something, you guys aren't focusing as much on reading development at the high school level, but we are focusing on adapting and accommodating reading demands. That can mean that kids just need extra time. It can mean that kids need a reader. Again, if we're evaluating their knowledge on something and they seem to know enough in class, during class discussions, that they should be getting a grade at a certain level, and the grades they're getting on those reading and writing assignments are not at that level, very likely we're measuring it inaccurately. And that's why extra time, a reader, sometimes a scribe, assistive technology are necessary, because those accommodations, they level the playing field. Because we're trying to figure out what's in the brain. What do they have? If they didn't study, it doesn't matter if you give someone a reader. They're going to fail anyway if they didn't know it before the test. So we're not looking to create this unfair advantage. What we're looking to do is, okay, if it's there, let's try and figure out a way to get it out. Without a reader, perhaps, they get a 50. With the reader, maybe they get a 75. Well, that 75 is a better representation of what they knew. And at the end of the day, that's all you're trying to do when you're evaluating anything. If you're measuring someone's height and they're slouching, you're going to tell them, stand straight, put your heels up against the wall. You want to get an accurate read. And you're measuring their knowledge on Romeo and Juliet, it's the same thing. So with writing, one of the things that's really, really tough and that's most commonly is a touchy subject is the topic of spelling. You've probably picked up on the fact that I don't think it's that important. Doesn't mean it's not important at all, but I'm saying of the 6 things I mentioned earlier, from reading, writing, and math, skills versus applications, spelling is the least important. And I'll argue with anyone on that topic. Doesn't mean it's not important. But it's the least important, because you can be a really good writer even if you can't spell. The other things on that list, the reading, writing, and math applications and skills, it's really hard to do those things if you don't have the basics of them. It's hard to read for comprehension if you can't read accurately. It's much harder to do math if you don't have any calculation skills. But spelling does not make a good writer. We all know people who are excellent spellers and horrible writers, but we also know people who are bad spellers who actually have the capacity or are good writers. I know high school English teachers that have learning disorders. They're not good spellers, but their writing is exceptional. The idea of spelling being so important is it's really tough because it's a really easy thing for elementary school teachers to grade, to quantify, because it's right and it's wrong. And for years, it was thought that it was a really important part of the literacy development process. But a lot of kids remember it for a test, and 2 days later, they can't spell any of those words. And that's not very helpful. So that process, the hours they've spent in class and then at home, and that's the biggest one. Kids go home and their parents are spending so much time. No, we're gonna be late for hockey practice. We've gotta work on these words for a little bit longer. No, you can't go play with your buddy because we gotta work on these words a little bit longer. Why? I'm just gonna forget them 3 days later anyway. And so we're focusing on these areas at times that are not as productive. Spend that time on reading. Every kid should be reading every day. Learning disorder or not, every kid should be reading every day. I'm in no way suggesting we go easy on kids. Any of you who know me as a parent know that that's not my approach. Right, Jen? We push our kids, but we push them strategically. We got to push them in the areas where they're going to actually have benefits, where they're going to see some growth. If we spend hours and hours and hours on spelling memorization or on math fact memorization and they're not remembering them, and it's not a memory issue, it's a decoding issue that's causing the lack of retention, we should focus on something different. Because it's not going to suddenly happen. Spelling is not improved as much through spelling tests or through spelling memorization. It's improved through reading. For anyone here who's a really good speller, the way it got there was because you read lots, or at some point you read lots. So with math, for the math teachers in the room, if someone knows their basic math facts but doesn't have a clue how to use them, it does them no good. So in that sense, if we're focusing on memorizing spelling words or memorizing math facts, I'd much rather my kids understand the math concepts. Ideally, yes, they have both the calculation skill and the application. But a lot of kids, and learning disorders are way more common than we realize. The research varies, but anywhere from 10 to 25% of kids have some form of a diagnosable specific learning disorder. Not that generic kind of, in a pediatrician's letter, have learning disabilities kind of comment, but an actual decoding issue that would qualify as having a learning disorder. 10 to 25% of kids, that's a lot of kids. What do you have, 1,800 kids at your school? That's hundreds of kids. Not all of them are going to be formally identified. But we need to make sure that we're looking for some of those signs. And so if we're looking at memorizing math facts, or if we're looking at understanding math concepts, if we're looking at memorizing spelling words versus becoming a good writer, we want to focus more on the application, because those are going to be more beneficial. And the idea too that in the real world we won't have a calculator, we do. I'm pretty sure all of us on our person somewhere has a phone, right? And the idea that we aren't going to be able to use technology like scribing, like assistive technology in the real world, that's also not true. It's very accessible. A Chromebook's $200. We can use, I don't type any of my own reports anymore. I have someone who types them for me. We can scribe things. There's technology, there's ways around it. And so to think that we need to have be kind of a hard line with some of those basic skills, those basic skills aren't as important as the applications are. And so if I don't do well in my English class because I'm a poor speller and it's created this pathology, that's not the reason I shouldn't be doing well in English class. If I don't show up for class, if I don't study, if I don't work hard, well, those are reasons why I shouldn't do well in English class. Now, this is a tough one because punctuation is important, but just like spelling is slow to develop with someone who has a learning disorder, so are some of these things. So again, I'm not saying it's not important. This is where editing comes in. But we also have to see where the student's at in their progression of accepting the fact that they maybe have a learning disorder. Some kids, and I can think of kids at your school who I've assessed, they will edit, they will do 4 or 5 drafts of an essay, they will spend the time necessary to make sure these types of mistakes aren't there, but they'll also need support with that. They need help from either parents or teachers. Then there's the other kids who are so frustrated and just so far gone on that path of I hate school, they're not going to do it. They're going to write it once and hand it in. Well, I'm not saying that we don't factor in punctuation, for example, but let's also make sure that we're focusing on content. And then once the confidence grows and the student realizes, oh, content's way more important than whether a comma was here or a comma was there, or whether I spelled this word right or spelled this word wrong. Once kids start seeing that, then they're more likely, when they're writing an essay, to put the effort in, because now they're going, well, my teacher seems to really like my ideas, so at least I'm going to give them my ideas. And maybe I'll read it a second time and go through it and make some changes to make sure I didn't make some of those basic mistakes I did last time. But it happens when confidence is there. When we start to see a little bit of success, and when they start to realize that teachers are working with them on what is more important. And it is more important that the content is there than if the spelling accuracy is there, or even, grandpa's safety aside, if the punctuation is correct. One of the most common things that you'll see with kids who have math learning disorders is that they want to do it either in their head, or they just use really strange methods to get the answers. Those are the most common ways. Now, there are people who do those things that don't have learning disorders. So I'm not saying everyone who does that has a learning disorder, but those are the 2 most common ways. And so you'll want to look for some of those things. In math, though, it's not as big of a deal to not know some of your math facts, because there's always a way to get those. In high school, correct me if I'm wrong, everyone can use a calculator, is that right? No, not, there's certain parts you can't, right? Certain parts you can, certain parts you can't. And so, and that's Alberta-wide, right? Yeah. So there's certain things we can't move with on that until the curriculum were to change, or if it ever does. But when we watch in certain areas and someone's doing really well in the parts where they have a calculator and really poorly in the parts where they don't, that is an indication again that they're understanding concepts perhaps quite well, but they need the calculator in order to demonstrate that understanding. Same thing like if someone's a really good writer but they just make a lot of spelling mistakes, same thing with that. So with math, the biggest accommodation, the most important accommodation is oftentimes extra time. Because oftentimes if you have the capacity and you've spent the time studying to prepare for that math exam, you get the concepts, but you need the extra time to be able to demonstrate that understanding. That extra time is really important, but that's only a part of it, because if I just give someone extra time but they don't know how to use the extra time, that isn't always going to be very effective. So our job then is to show them these are the ways to avoid making these little mistakes. When you finish this, go back and how can we make sure that this is correct? Maybe the decimal place should be 1 over, or something to that effect. This is where we have to make sure, estimation, just even learning how to estimate more effectively. A lot of kids don't really get that unless they're directly shown what we're talking about with estimation. When do I estimate? Do I estimate after I've completed it? Before I've started? Partway through? And this is where math teachers are really well equipped to provide that level of insight. And that's where sometimes we have to show the kids that we believe in them, though, and then provide them with those teaching opportunities. This is, if I'm going to give you 4 hours for this exam, or 6 hours, or whatever the number is, double time, this is what I want you to use it for. This is how you use extra time. And that's something that'll be valuable in high school. Ideally, it'll also be helpful when they move on to college and university, because that is the goal. If a child has the capacity and they want to move on to post-secondary, we hope that the things you're teaching them in high school are things they can then incorporate within their college and university training. These are common things that that you might just notice in a general sense when there are specific learning disorders. Little reversals, again, not as common at the high school level, but if a child tells you, yeah, I was 10 before I stopped reversing my B's and D's, that's not normal. Even though sometimes I've heard people say, oh no, that's typical, that's okay. You don't do it anymore, so it must be fine. You must have just worked itself out. No, That's unusual, right? Not many 10-year-olds who are still flipping B's and D's unless there's a learning disorder. Those symbols are arbitrary. There is no logic that you can use to say, well, a B is a B because of this, and a D is a D because of this, and a P is a P because of this, and a Q is a Q because of this. There's no logic that we can use to explain those things. You just have to know them. And if someone has a hard time just knowing them, that's an indication of a decoding issue. So if they are telling you that, you may want to also then look for things like, do they skip words when they're reading? That's another indication of a learning disorder. Very rarely is that an actual visual issue. Because if it was, they could spell. And the kids who are skipping when they read also can't spell. So going and doing tracking therapy, while it may slow them down when they're reading and help them become a more accurate reader possibly, it doesn't fix the fundamental problem. It doesn't identify the fundamental problem, which is a decoding issue. And so that's another thing to look for, is skipping words when they read. Do they tell you that the words get all blurry when they read? They can't focus when they read? Again, common manifestation of a learning disorder that's affecting reading. But by the time they get to high school, it's not that they can't read, it's that these things are happening when they are reading. So it just looks like there's some weird things about when they read, but they're okay. Not always okay. And that's when you want to talk to your LAT and say, okay, do we need to look into this a little bit further? They talk about this, or the grades aren't showing this, or when they read out loud in class, holy cow, I couldn't believe how bad it was. But they're doing okay on the exam, or they're doing okay on the essay. Are they writing their own essay? These are the things we want to look for, because those are the things they may be coping right now okay. Probably the grades aren't always going to be representative of what they could be. But if they're going on to college or university, and we don't know that there isn't a learning disorder, and there's a suspicion that there possibly is, they're possibly a kid who then goes in first semester fails out, because they're no longer getting any of the support that you could kind of unofficially provide for them. And college and university is a little bit harder possibly, depending on the program that they're in. There's just these certain things that just take them past that threshold, and now they're not successful, even though they were able to be just barely successful in your class. And so again, just something you want to talk to your LAT about, just to see, okay, maybe we do a level B just to see where they're at. Because maybe they're just hiding it really well, other than that one day when I had them read out loud. Reading out loud, for lots of people, depending on anxiety issues and whatnot, but so many people will tell me, if I'm doing an assessment with a high school kid or an adult, well, I've got test anxiety. I get test anxiety, or I get anxiety speaking in front of people. And I'm not saying that that's not a real thing. But oftentimes, the reason for the test anxiety is because it takes me 5 times to read the question before I can wrap it in my head what I'm telling them. What do they want from me? I don't even know what to do. 5 times later, okay, now, well, this person's on page 5. I'm still on page 1. I better start rushing. And so it's those types of little atypicalities that we consider an anxiety issue. The anxiety is likely a byproduct. It's not likely the primary barrier. It's likely the outcome of the fact that this is really hard for me. Something so simple as just reading the question is so hard for me. And so, or if I have to read out loud in my English class, man, that's super embarrassing. And it's not embarrassing just because I don't want people to hear my voice, it's because I don't read very well. And so those little differences make a big difference for that student, and may result in them skipping a class because they don't want to be there for some part of if they know this is coming. Or it may result in them choosing to be a little bit defiant that day in class, so that way they get sent to the office. Or those types of things can even happen. And it's oftentimes a function of kind of those underlying frustrations. The highlighted in yellow areas are the ones that I mentioned before. This is not about just being easier on kids and not trying to grow. It's about trying to be strategic. So when I'm identifying a learning disorder, the 4 areas there that I've highlighted, those are the 4 to focus on the most. But again, at the high school level, this isn't as relevant. Unless you've got students who are really motivated and want to grow these skills, then yes, this is still very relevant. A lot of times by this age, kids will just tell me, no, I'm not going to read. It doesn't matter. You could suggest it all you want, and I'm still not going to read. Then I say, okay, then listen to audiobooks. Because for the English teachers in the room, the way that we grow vocabulary is not just through conversation. If we read more, our vocabulary grows as well. And if we just don't read because it's hard, our vocabulary doesn't grow as fast because we're not exposed to as many words. So it's really important that even if the kid is not wanting to read, that we're saying, okay, fine, then let's listen to a book. Because then you might find that they'll at least get into the series of if it is a series, or into that certain topic, and they maybe want to read more, or maybe after they listen to it once, maybe now they will read it the second time without the audio version. But it doesn't mean we stop trying to expose kids to reading material. It just means we have to be a bit strategic. We could battle them and say, no, you're going to read for 10 minutes every night, and it's going to be hell for both of us, but we're going to do it anyway. Realistically, they're going to sit there with the book open and not really do what they're supposed to do if they're that frustrated. So then you get the audio book and you just try and prime them for it. Again, it doesn't mean we stop exposing kids to books. It means we have to figure out a different way to get the information into our heads. The purpose of a book is not to read accurately. The purpose of the book is to comprehend what's in there. Of course, it's easier if they can read it accurately and fluently and it all goes kind of like it's supposed to. But for some kids, that won't be the case, and so then we figure out a different way. And that's the nice thing about technology now. You can get any book in audio format. It's really simple. You can even go on audible.com and you can find celebrities to read those books for you. There's ways around it, and we want the kids to get the exposure to the written language. If they can't do it without support, let's get them in the audio version. If you're in a class with them and they've had a textbook and you know they're not going to read that textbook, it is not going to get opened. We need to get that textbook in audio format so that they can still be exposed. Now, if they still choose not to listen to the audio and they don't study and they skip classes and they fail because of that, you've done everything you can then. You've supported that student. If you didn't get the audio book, if you didn't give them the extra time, if you didn't have the conversation with them to let them know, look, this is what I want from you. If they fail because of those reasons, that's different. We could have done more then. But if you've done everything you can and you know that and you've removed the barriers and they fail because they didn't put effort in, at this point there's going to be some kids where that's just the case. Just a matter of making sure that we know that we've done everything we can. These are some of the things that kind of factor into what to focus on and when. How old are they? How frustrated are they? How motivated are they? What's home life like? That's a really big one. A lot of times when I'm doing an assessment, especially at a high school level where we've got a lot of really skilled teachers, I may come in and just tell you something that the teacher you already kind of knew. I'm not blowing your mind with, I'm saying this is a learning disorder. You've already seen the level B results. You've seen some of the day-to-day anecdotals. So I'm coming in and telling you that it's a specific learning disorder, and as a teacher, that may be something you go, well, yeah, duh. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. This was a really obvious textbook case. But for that parent, that's not as simple. Because most parents don't have an understanding of what a learning disorder is. They know what memory is, and they oftentimes think that my kid's got a memory issue. They know what behavior looks like. They oftentimes will think my kid's a bit of a jackass. But they aren't necessarily going to understand what a learning disorder is. And so that conversation with that parent can change the belief system or the understanding of how well they're going to support that child. Now, there are other times where the parent goes, well, I don't care anyway. They're on their own. They're 17. But in some cases, it will make a difference. And so it's a matter of making sure that we understand what the home supports are like. One of the things, too, parents will tell me, my kids are already at Sylvan Learning Center or the Reading Foundation in Calgary or Sound Connections, or they work with a private tutor. Well, those things can also factor in, and those aren't necessarily bad things, but they can also make it more difficult, more complicated to identify the underlying literacy issue because they might have been greenhoused a little bit. So certain skills that because they're working with this tutor 3 times a week, they're getting so much exposure. It's kind of like that kid who makes a hockey team because they were on the ice every day all summer, and then when tryouts came around, they were greenhoused. But by Christmas, they were not really probably on the right team, and there was probably kids who didn't make the team who could have, but they played baseball all summer. So it's the idea of being greenhoused. So those are things that just make it more complicated to identify if there's something there. I'm actually going to skip. You said 9:40 is the latest? 9:30. Okay. This is something, again, we've already talked about this a little bit. I wish I had this skill when I was in school. I'm not sure what you do with that as a teacher. I guess a conversation with the student. One of the things that's really, really important for teachers when we're doing any sort of writing assignment with kids is make sure that we want them to take risks, take chances when you're writing. And for a lot of kids, especially with learning disorders, that means using a word that you don't know how to spell. Because one of the most embarrassing things for people, not just kids, is spelling a word wrong. It's a silly embarrassment, it's not logical, but it's one of the most common embarrassments for kids who are writing, or for adults who are writing. And so, one of the things that's really important is to de-emphasize spelling, which means use words you don't know how to spell. Because it's going to challenge them and it's going to make them use a more expansive vocabulary. They're going to use more descriptive words. And that's what we want. We can always teach kids to go back and edit. But if they've chosen really safe, basic vocabulary because of their fear of mistakes, there's not a whole lot to edit. It's just a really crappy writing. Whereas if they've chosen something where there's a bunch of spelling mistakes, but it's really descriptive, now there's something to work with. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on taking chances when writing, using those big words, and then once the confidence has grown, which can take some time, now we focus on editing. Now we focus on going back and let's go over this again and just make sure there aren't some things we could fix. But to start with, we need to make sure that they're using the words that they're capable of using. We've talked about some of these things already. This is one of my examples from when I was a kid and my dad asked me how to solve a problem. No, I'm just kidding, that's not what I did. But it's what I wanted to do. Sometimes it's just as simple as reducing quantity, focusing on estimation. Obviously kids need to know how to use a calculator. And then when you're solving a problem, make notes. Write things down. So these are questions that when I'm debriefing an assessment, I'm commonly asked. The accommodations, the idea of unfair advantage. I struggle with that. I guess the way I would term it is more kids who have learning disorders have an unfair disadvantage. If the child is work ethic and intelligence. Work ethic and intelligence are the two most important things in school. We can't control intelligence very much. We can control it a little bit, but we can't control it very much. There's certain things that we have the ability to do, and if we work at it, it will improve, but we also there's a range, right? Work ethic, there is no range. If you're working hard, if you're working as hard as you can, that's all you can do. A learning disorder is not something anyone chooses to have. And it's not always obvious. Some cases are really obvious. But there's a lot of mild to moderate learning disorders that are really kind of subtle. So providing an accommodation like extra time or using assistive technology or a reader, they're not providing an unfair advantage. All they're doing is providing that child with an opportunity to prove what they're capable of. And without those accommodations, they don't have that opportunity. And that may seem, if you're looking at it as a teacher, you may think, well, that still seems unfair to me. Look at it like a parent. Think of it as if it was your own child, or a nephew, or a niece, or a spouse. It's a little different when you think of it from that perspective, because at that point you realize, okay, well, I don't want my child's opportunities long-term to be limited because they can't spell. I want them to have opportunities that are consistent with how hard they're working and with their fundamental capacity for learning. And if we can do some things to accommodate those things, and it might be something just as simple as, yes, you're going to use extra time on this exam and this is how you're going to use it. You're going to give that child an opportunity to not be the welder's helper, but to be the welder. Right? And those are little differences that affect their trajectory forever is affected by that difference. And so it's really important to not look at it that way, because it's not accurate. And this is one that I never really thought about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but in it, when we had some training done through the FASD clinic I'm a part of, this is one that's commonly used there, because we're talking there more typically of people who have really significant cognitive impairments that are affecting day-to-day life. And in those cases, it's really important to understand what our rights are as people. But for learning disorders, it's kind of the same thing. We have a right to an education process that will allow us to prove what we're capable of. Again, if I just don't work hard and I don't succeed because I don't work hard, that's different. But if I'm working hard and there's a barrier that I couldn't control, and it's not a comprehension type barrier, it's a decoding type barrier, if I just can't wrap my head around something because I don't have the capacity for that, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about someone who has the capacity, but we didn't remove the barriers that would allow them to prove it. That's a right that we should all have. This is more common in the past, but the setting kids up for failure. I don't hear that as often now because most people now know that Red Deer College, U of A, U of C, University of Iowa, they all provide accommodations if you have documentation to prove it. If you choose not to show them the report, no, they're not going to provide you with an accommodation. If you show them the report and have that conversation with their student services department, they will provide you with accommodations. That's North America wide. Any accredited college and university will. But you have to have the report. So, and it has to be within 5 years. And there's a bit of, depending on the school, but 5 years is the general, And so that's why we try and time things with certain assessments to make sure that we don't have to assess kids more than necessary. It's a waste of money. You may as well try and time it for when you can use that report afterwards. It does, if you take a couple years off after high school and then try and go on, that can be a factor, but again, that's why usually most of the assessments are done in grade 11 is the most common time, but if they haven't been assessed previously. But colleges and universities always provide those supports. And honestly, in most colleges and universities, the supports are even better than what you can get in a high school setting, because at a college and university level, you are removing the need for supports for kids who have more significant cognitive issues. Like you here at the high school level, you have kids that their learning abilities range from below the 1st percentile to the 99th percentile from a cognitive perspective. At the college and university level, there's not that. It's much more narrow. So the types of accommodations are much more specific to kids who have learning disorders. That's the most common pattern or group of accommodations. So most schools are set up really well for that. Memory, and this is something I talked about earlier a little bit, memory and learning disorders oftentimes kind of are confused, because if I can't remember how to spell a word, it must be a memory issue. It's not. It's not a memory issue. That's a common one I'm asked though, because it looks like a memory issue in certain cases. It's not a memory issue, it's memory for code. It's memory for what does this word look like? It's memory for what is 5 times 6 again? It's those types of memories. And it's because those memories, for those of us who don't have learning disorders, you visualize it, you know the answer. But those codes make sense to you. If you've got a learning disorder, those codes don't make sense to you, so it's much more challenging to memorize those things. So it's not a memory issue on a global level, it's a memory for code issue. Okay, now Dan has told me I need to stop talking, and so I'm going to stop unless there's any questions that people have. Okay, all right, crickets. Thanks, Dan.
Ready enough firing.
All right, thanks, Jerry. You're a really busy guy, and we appreciate you coming out. One of the things that stood out for me when I heard you talk in October, even just started making it crystal clear, and what I'm going to ask everyone here to do is, we focused on literacy and numeracy. Our district is focused on literacy and numeracy, but there's not a single one of you out there, teachers, that's not affected by literacy and numeracy. Right? You are not. It doesn't matter if you're a phys ed, doesn't matter if you're CTS, right? It doesn't matter if you're an art teacher or you're in drama or you're in music. Kids need to know how to read. Decoding is important. Numeracy is important. And I need you to just sort of ponder how that affects how you organize your classes, right? What we do to help our kids that struggle with these issues. What do you do individually? And I'm really big, I think you know, is us taking a look at individuals and what they need. Not just a blanket, we do the same thing for all kids. That's not equity, right? That's not equity at all. Our district's focusing on equity. We spent a whole bunch of time coming up with a school mission. And the last line of our mission is we will ensure the supports are in place to help students reach their full potential. With what we know now about accommodations, about learning disabilities, if we are not doing those things, we're not living up to our mission. And so we've come a long way in helping provide accommodations and looking at individuals individually in our school. And it's evidenced by the rates, the success rates we're getting. But what I think is really cool about the potential for this is not only those kids that are failing, but taking that student, that decided to go -2 because they've never been good at reading, or take a -3 math because they have numeracy deficiencies. I think I took a look at some kids that go maybe into CTS, right into our shop guys, and say, you know, they did struggle in school all along, but then they get in there and they can't read the modules and things that they need to do. And so wanting to help them reach their full potential, whatever they do, that is very, very important to what we are telling our parents when they bring their kids to us that we're going to provide for them. So it's not easy work at all, right? But I think it's the right work to do, and I think it's where we're going to make the biggest gains. We have phenomenal results right now. We do. We're graduating kids, we're getting kids through. What we want to do is look at where we can get better. That's all this is about. So it's not, oh, we're doing a crappy job, because we are not. We're doing a fantastic job. But this is where the hard work is going to be. When you examine your own practice and you decide maybe you need to assess differently, that I sit down and tell a kid how to use that extra time. I talked with Randy and something that he was talking about teaching kids how to learn or stopping a test. And stop marking a test because I realized the kids didn't get it at this point. I know you guys are doing some phenomenal things and we want to share those, but that's why I think this is important. That's why I appreciate when I heard Jared's presentation. Again, I wasn't taught those things in university. I'm having a conversation with Michael and some teacher preparation. With what we know about the brain and stuff, I would hope that in our teacher prep programs, that our young teachers are learning more about this than I was ever taught, because we're expected to be picking this stuff up now. And we're doing it. We're learning and things like that. I'm not sure that the teacher education programs are doing this, but with what we know about the brain and how kids learn and how we can help them learn, we, should be preparing our teachers better than we were prepared, quite frankly. So, but what I appreciate about you guys is that you're willing to do that hard work. We have LATs, we have learning support teams to help you. No one's expected to know this. I don't know it. I'm trying to learn all the time. So I appreciate that, Jared will come here, share his thoughts with us. Jared can solve story history. Jared works with our counselors and our learning support teams, our LATs, to help identify things that are in there. So I know we'll get better. And again, Jared, appreciate your time and I appreciate your guys' attention. Thank you.
Thank you.